In the fading light of October 1807, a troubling pattern emerged along a rugged 20-mile stretch of the Pine Hollow route in the East Texas Territory. 17 travelers vanished, completely, wordlessly, permanently. Their horses were found grazing by the roadside, their belongings strewn with eerie deliberation. No bodies, no notes, no bandits demanding ransom. The silence surrounding these disappearances was deafening, but not natural, especially once it became clear that local officials had deliberately suppressed the investigation, not overlooked, buried. For nearly 2 centuries, what happened along that road remained a forbidden whisper in Elmridge County. That is, until 1989, when a retired archivist stumbled upon sealed ledgers in the basement of the old county courthouse. They didn't just hold clues, they told of a coordinated murder operation, the kind that operated in plain sight under the guise of Christian mercy. The perpetrators? The most beloved family in the region, the Bellamys. Their homestead became a haven for the weary, a place of prayer and promise, and eventually, a graveyard with no headstones. But before we descend into the horrors concealed in their cellar and the church that blessed them, take a moment to subscribe. This story unearths more than bodies. It rips the mask off one of early America's most sacred facades. What made the Bellamy case so disturbing wasn't just the method of the murders. It was how long it worked. For 8 years, their acts of kindness hid a machinery of death, a sanctuary where no one ever left. The farm itself, located a few miles south of Elmridge, was rich, unusually so. Locals whispered that the land was blessed. It wasn't. It was soaked in the blood of innocents who'd been drawn in by kindness, lulled by scripture, and extinguished before anyone could realize what was happening. The story begins, as many do, not with a scream, but with paperwork, a rotting file drawer, a torn court document, and the faint smell of something wrong, deeply, deliberately wrong. Back in 1807, the Pine Hollow route was more than a trail. It was a lifeline. Carved through dense pine woods and limestone ridges, it stretched from the Louisiana border to the interior towns of the East Texas Territory. Merchants, settlers, preachers, and fugitives alike depended on it. And nestled halfway along its most treacherous bend sat the township of Elmridge. With barely 250 residents, Elmridge was the kind of place where reputations meant more than facts. The settlement had been founded in 1803 by a group of Presbyterian separatists from Georgia looking to escape what they called the corruption of the coast. They brought their firebrand faith with them and built a new kind of order. No dancing, no liquor, and no questioning of the pulpit. The town orbited around its 3 core buildings, Abner's Provisions, the Silver Elm Inn, and the Mercy Ridge Chapel. Abner's was both supply depot and rumor mill, run by old Thaddeus Abner, a man with a crooked back and a sharper tongue. The inn, managed by widowed Charlotte Pierce, catered to travelers who didn't want to sleep under the stars or in the arms of God. And the church, well, it was less a chapel and more a fortress of discipline, led by Reverend Elias Croft, a man who preached damnation with such conviction it felt like prophecy. But nothing, and no one, seemed to command as much admiration as the Bellamy family. They arrived in 1799, claiming to have fled violence near the Gulf Coast. The story was vague, some Spanish skirmish or bandit raid, but Elmridge didn't press. The Bellamys were a gift. Malachi Bellamy, the father, was a towering man with coal-black eyes and a booming voice that rattled the pews. His wife, Sybil, was known for her skill with herbal remedies. Locals began calling her the White Widow, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Their 3 children, Abram, Cyrus, and young Delilah, were shining examples of moral upbringing. The Bellamy homestead sat on 480 acres just past the Sycamore Gulch, land considered too marshy for good farming. Yet within 3 years, their fields burst with golden corn and thick tobacco. They built barns that dwarfed those of their neighbors, kept livestock no one had seen them buy, and furnished their 2-story home with goods that should have been impossible to afford. And still, people loved them. Especially travelers. The Bellamy farm was known far and wide as the safest place to stop before crossing the ridge. But safety, as it turned out, was only a performance. The Bellamys' reputation for hospitality wasn't just well known. It was legendary. Travelers deliberately adjusted their routes to pass by their farmstead. Local guides even recommended it as a preferred stopping point. "They'll feed you, patch you up, pray for your journey," they'd say. And the Bellamys always did, until they didn't. The main house was an architectural marvel for its time and place. 2 stories of whitewashed timber with hand-blown glass windows, imported shutters, and polished brass fixtures that glinted in the morning sun. Inside there were books, hundreds of them. Elegant oil lamps, a harpsichord in the parlor, silk curtains. It felt more like a wealthy Virginian plantati, on home than a pioneer cabin. That in itself should have raised questions. But no one wanted to question miracles when they needed one. Malachi Bellamy often hosted evening prayers for guests, his voice rising like a storm in the candlelight. Sybil would offer tonics and poultices for saddle sores and fevers. Abram and Cyrus helped with livestock or wagon repairs, and Delilah, then only 19, kept a meticulous guest log in a green velvet journal that never left her side. Every visitor was recorded, every item sold or gifted was noted. It all seemed so proper, so orderly, but that same log, discovered decades later, was missing key entries. Entire pages had been razored out. By autumn of 1807, an eerie rhythm emerged. Every few weeks, someone vanished after passing through Elmridge. A merchant named Oswald Finch, a circuit preacher called Elijah Bird, a family of 4, no names remembered, only that the children had red hair. And then came Solomon Dade. Solomon was no common traveler. He was a seasoned freight runner who knew the Pine Hollow route better than most. Always punctual, always cautious. He carried dry goods from New Orleans to Fort Houston with meticulous schedules that made him famous among frontier traders. On October 17th, he was due to arrive in Elmridge. He never did. His mule was found 2 days later near Crosswater Creek, just beyond the Bellamy property, tethered neatly to a cedar tree, unharmed, its saddle still loaded with goods. No sign of struggle, only a strange trail, personal items strewn one by one into the woods as if dropped deliberately, a leather pouch of silver coins, unopened. Whatever had taken Solomon Dade had not wanted money, and it had moved with such precision it left no tracks. When Solomon Dade vanished, it didn't go unnoticed. His business partner, Wallace Crane, was a former surveyor and a man of exacting standards. Wallace knew Solomon's routes down to the hour. After just one missed check-in, he raised alarm bells, not in Elmridge, but 70 miles west, where Solomon was supposed to deliver a shipment to the garrison at Fort Houston. Crane wasted no time. He rode east, retracing his partner's journey, asking questions at inns and supply posts. Everyone remembered Solomon, his big voice, clean boots, and a habit of checking his watch too often. His trail was perfectly documented up to Elmridge. And then, nothing. The mule, found standing calmly beside a tree, still wore its saddle and reins, but the bridle had been unfastened and draped neatly over a low-hanging branch. That one small detail told Crane everything. Solomon hadn't run off. He hadn't been attacked by wolves or thieves. Someone had taken him, deliberately, and taken the time to make it look like nothing had happened. And all trails, metaphorical and literal, pointed back to the Bellamy farm. Crane rode into Elmridge and met with the town's constable, a former Army scout named Israel Ford. Ford was no stranger to death. He'd fought at Tippecanoe and tracked deserters through Cherokee hunting grounds. He knew what random violence looked like. Solomon's disappearance didn't fit that pattern. Ford assembled a small search party, local hunters, a Choctaw tracker named Enoch, and a retired ranger who'd buried 3 wives and had nothing to lose. They followed what little evidence they had. Solomon's discarded kerchief caught on a pine bough, a heel mark in the clay, and faint smears that could have been blood. The trail ran cold right at the edge of the Bellamy fence line. Beyond that, nothing. Not a broken branch, not a blade of grass out of place. Ford questioned the family, Malachi, answered every query with warmth and concern. Yes, Solomon had stopped at their farm, but only for water and directions. No, he hadn't stayed the night. Sybil claimed he looked uneasy, said he thought he was being followed by men on the trail. Cyrus and Abram swore he'd declined their offer to rest. Delilah even produced a record of his visit, written in that same velvet-bound log with precise time and date. Every answer was smooth, polished, rehearsed. Constable Ford had heard dozens of alibis in his day, but none so perfectly synchronized. It felt less like a memory and more like a script. Constable Israel Ford had learned long ago that lies often came wrapped in truth, and the Bellamys' story about Solomon Dade, it glittered, too clean, too complete, like a glass bottle without a single scratch. That alone made him suspicious. Ford returned to the Bellamy farm the next evening under the pretense of purchasing fresh tobacco for a local judge. It gave him the chance to observe. The family welcomed him with their usual grace. Malachi greeted him on the porch, towering and barefoot, as if to show he had nothing to hide. Sybil offered coffee laced with nutmeg. Abram and Cyrus hauled barrels in the yard, eyes lowered but hands precise. Delilah barely looked up from her sewing. But what struck Ford most wasn't their hospitality. It was the strain beneath it. Sybil's hands trembled slightly as she poured the coffee. Her smile wavered when he asked about harvests. Delilah stole nervous glances at her father after every word, and Cyrus, normally boisterous, flinched when Ford's boot scuffed the wood near the root cellar. That was new. The root cellar. Ford remembered the Bellamy homestead from months earlier. There'd been no entrance there then. Now a crude stone passage descended into the earth behind the smokehouse. The structure looked freshly reinforced, planks still fragrant with sap, dirt still loose along the edges. Malachi explained it away without being asked. "Expanded for storage," he said. "Sybil's pickling everything in sight. We'll be selling to buyers from Nacogdoches come spring." Reasonable. Too reasonable. Ford nodded and left, but he didn't ride far. Instead, he doubled back after midnight with Enoch, the Choctaw tracker. From the tree line above the Bellamy pasture, they watched. What they saw disturbed them both. Lanterns, too many for night chores, moved between the barn and the cellar. Not quickly, methodically. They watched silhouettes carry something long and heavy, twice. Then came a strange sound, a deep, hollow clank, like metal striking stone. And then, silence, thick, total. Ford returned to Elmridge at dawn and began digging, not with a shovel, but with questions. He asked the town's blacksmith about recent tool orders, the lumber mill about timber requests, and what he found painted a new picture. Over the last 3 months, the Bellamys had quietly acquired enough wood, nails, and iron to build something large, something underground. But not a single neighbor had been asked to help. That, in Ford's experience, was not how farms worked. Constable Ford kept his suspicions quiet. In a town like Elmridge, accusations carried weight, and to accuse the Bellamys would be to challenge the very foundation of the community's pride. Still, he continued collecting whispers. He visited a widow named Hetty Clay, who lived in a sagging cabin half a mile from the Bellamy's eastern boundary. Hetty was hard of hearing but sharp-eyed. She remembered odd things. Some nights, she told him, "You hear hammering, real late, like somebody building a church under the dirt." She'd seen more, too. Strangers passing by, asking if the Bellamy farm was the safe place folks mentioned. Then, never seeing them again. Ford thanked her and took his questions to others. One by one, neighbors shared little things they'd dismissed. A team of oxen heard groaning deep in the woods near the property. A pile of bones found along the fence, animal bones, they assumed, though one man quietly admitted some of them looked too clean-cut. A girl said her dog came home with a man's torn glove in its mouth, soaked in something darker than mud. It was all circumstantial, but the pattern was unmistakable. Then came the child. 9-year-old Thomas Elger lived with his family in a lean-to shack 2 miles north. Known for wandering off, he often played near Sycamore Gulch. On March 4th, he arrived at the constable's office with a story that sounded like nonsense, until Ford realized what he was really saying. "I heard someone crying," the boy said. "A man. Real loud, from under the ground." He described screams that lasted until just before sunrise. "And there was music," he added. "Weird music, like singing, but no words." Ford pressed him. How often had he heard it? 3 times since snow melted, the boy answered, holding up 3 fingers. "Always when the moon's real small." Ford checked the dates. Every scream the boy heard matched the exact night a traveler was last seen heading through Elmridge, a missionary in February, a trapper in March, a young woman named Hester Wells just a week earlier. Ford's mouth went dry. The Bellamy farm wasn't just a place of suspicion anymore. It was a house with walls built on vanishing. And somewhere beneath it, people were screaming. Then silenced. Constable Ford knew he couldn't act alone. The Bellamys weren't just a family. They were Elmridge's saints. To accuse them without proof would be suicide, politically and perhaps literally. So, he turned to the only people who still whispered about things others refused to see. He met with Samuel Kittredge, a retired scout who'd fought under General Wilkinson and once tracked a gang of river pirates across 4 counties. Kittredge had no fondness for men who wore piety like armor. When Ford laid out the evidence, vanished travelers, expanding cellars, screams in the night, Kittredge nodded once and said, "You've got a killing farm." Next came Mary Calhoun, an herbalist with no love for the church. She'd always said Sybil Bellamy's remedies worked too fast and too clean. Her theory: the woman knew medicine because she practiced it on people who never left alive. And finally, Enoch. The Choctaw tracker had followed dozens of trails in his life, human, animal, storm-washed. He agreed to do something dangerous, get close to the Bellamy farm and find out if the earth still held secrets. 3 nights later, he returned, ashen-faced. "There's something beneath," he said. "Not just a cellar, a warren. I counted 3 exhaust vents disguised as well stones. And the soil's wrong. It's been turned too often, not for crops." Ford made his choice. He couldn't wait for a court order. He couldn't involve the local judge. Malachi Bellamy had married his niece. Instead, Ford sent messages westward to Fort Houston under the pretense of needing surveyors. What he got back was better. 2 ex-rangers who owed him favors, men with eyes for ambush and hands steady in the dark. The plan was simple. No accusations, no warrant. Just a walk into the farm, a polite visit, and a reason, any reason, to descend into the cellar. But that plan collapsed on May 9th. That night, Ford was roused by frantic banging at his cabin door. It was Delilah Bellamy, alone, mud-slicked, barefoot, her face pale as snow, her fingernails bloody down to the cuticle. "They're going to kill another one," she whispered. "Tomorrow, a man named Harrow, a surveyor." She paused, trembling. "There's more. There's 3 down there, maybe 4, and they're still alive." Ford didn't speak. He couldn't, because in Delilah's eyes, he didn't just see guilt. He saw terror, not of what her family had done, but of what they still intended to do. Delilah Bellamy sat trembling beside the hearth in Constable Ford's cabin, her hands wrapped around a mug she couldn't seem to lift. She hadn't run from guilt, she'd run from being next. "They don't call it murder," she said flatly. "They call it cleansing. They say the Lord approves, that he guides the choosing." Her voice was hollow, mechanical. She had repeated these phrases too many times in too many prayers not to know them by heart. Ford didn't push. He let the words come like a slow leak from a cracked dam. "They only take the ones who seem corrupt," she continued. "Drifters, wealthy men, people who ask too many questions or travel alone too long. Father says it's a holy duty. Abram calls it a trial. Cyrus—" She stopped. A long silence followed. "Cyrus likes it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She told Ford everything. They'd begun soon after arriving in Elmridge. Their first was a tax collector, drunk, loud, arrogant. Malachi declared him unworthy. Sybil dosed his stew. He never woke up. But that wasn't the plan. That was improvisation. What followed was structure. Malachi crafted the theology, a belief that the frontier was lawless because God's law was absent. He'd fill that void. He built what he called the Judgment Hall, a network of rooms carved beneath the farmland, starting from the original root cellar and expanding outward into limestone caves and hand-chiseled passages. The victims were chosen, assessed, judged. "They really think it's justice," Delilah said. "They say every one of them was tested. We ask questions over dinner, where they come from, why they travel, what they believe, if they lie or boast or show arrogance." She trailed off again. "What happens after that?" Ford asked. Her eyes rose slowly to meet his. "They get the tea, drugged, disarmed, delivered to the underground. There, Malachi conducted mock trials, verses read aloud, crimes listed, and then the sentence, hanging, drowning, sometimes worse. And now, in the chambers below that whitewashed farmhouse, 3 more souls were being held. One was Harrow, a land surveyor. The second, Rebecca Lowe, a woman from Fort Jesper who'd gone missing 3 weeks ago. The third? Delilah didn't know his name, just his screams. "I tried to help them," she said, shaking. "But now Father says I'm unclean. I'm next. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon." Constable Ford rose and took his rifle from the wall. Then he handed one to Delilah. "You're not next," he said. "They are." Ford didn't sleep that night. Neither did Delilah. Instead, they mapped every step of the Bellamy farm, above Asaiiniwan and below. Delilah drew the layout on parchment with trembling hands. It was worse than Ford had feared. The underground wasn't just a cellar, it was a labyrinth. 5 chambers connected by stone-cut tunnels lined with wooden supports and iron brackets. 2 entrances, one through the root cellar and one hidden beneath a false slab deep in the east woods. "There are traps," she warned, "and watch points. Abram can see in the dark better than most men can at noon. They've trained for this, in case the judgment ever came to them." Ford rode out before dawn. He didn't go to the sheriff. He didn't go to the magistrate. He went to the few men in the county who believed in steel more than scripture. Samuel Kittredge returned, this time with an old powder pistol and a flintlock carbine. Enoch, the tracker, brought his bow and a hatchet carved with war symbols. And Elias Cray, a silent farmer whose wife had vanished near the Pine Hollow Trail 2 winters ago, showed up at the edge of town with no questions and a rope already coiled on his saddle horn. By nightfall, they were 5. Ford gave the orders calmly, but with steel behind every word. "We don't arrest. We don't wait. We find the prisoners. We stop the family, permanently." Delilah guided them through the Sycamore Gulch by moonlight, her cloak pulled low and her voice steady for the first time. When they reached the edge of the Bellamy farm, she stopped. "This is where I turn back," she said. "I've done my part." Ford looked at her, then handed her a pistol. "You'll need this more than we will." The others pressed forward in silence. They crossed the pasture by crawling along the ditch line, the scent of fresh-turned soil thick in the air. The smokehouse flickered with lamplight. The house was dark, but below, faintly, came the echo of voices. Not shouting, not pleading, chanting, low, rhythmic, in a language that only half resembled scripture. Enoch touched Ford's shoulder. "They're doing it now," he said. "The trial." Ford nodded. They had no more time. The farm wasn't a home anymore. It was a gallows wrapped in prayer, and tonight it would burn. They struck just past midnight. Ford and Kittredge entered through the root cellar. Its wooden doors swung open without resistance. Enoch and Cray circled wide to intercept anyone fleeing the east escape tunnel. Inside, the air was damp and bitter, laced with something metallic. Blood? Mold? Something older. The first chamber was lined with shelves, pickled vegetables, smoked meats, and tools that didn't belong in a cellar. Shackles, branding irons, a ledger open on the table listed names. The last was H. Harrow, deferred judgment, 3 days remaining. A scream echoed down the corridor. They moved. The judgment hall was worse than anything Ford had imagined. It resembled a courtroom only in symmetry. A raised wooden dais, benches carved with crosses, and a great iron crucifix hung upside down over the far wall. Underneath it stood Malachi Bellamy, arms outstretched like a conductor summoning holy vengeance. In front of him knelt a man, bound, gagged, and bruised, face down before what could only be described as an altar. 2 others huddled in iron cages along the wall, a woman with blood on her dress and a thin elderly man who didn't stir. Malachi looked up slowly as the door burst open. "Ah," he said, "the tribunal has come." He didn't flinch, didn't run. He smiled. "It is right for judgment to come upon us, but only the righteous may swing the sword." Abram and Cyrus lunged from the side passages. Kittredge fired. One shot caught Abram square in the chest, folding him like cloth. Cyrus slammed into Cray, who had slipped in behind. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and fury. Cray's knife struck fast, silent, final. Sybil emerged from the shadows, holding a small vial. She flung it toward Ford, but Enoch batted it aside. It shattered against the stone, releasing a choking, bitter smoke. She screamed not in fear, but in rage. "You blind men! You undo the work of heaven!" Malachi ran. Ford pursued him through the tunnels, heart pounding, the walls narrowing as they plunged deeper. He found him at the very end, near a shaft choked with roots. Malachi turned, blood flecking his lips. "You don't understand," he hissed. "This place, it purified the road. We saved this land." Ford raised his rifle. "And now I'm saving it from you." The shot echoed like thunder through the hall. Malachi Bellamy collapsed backward into the dark. When the dust settled, the chambers beneath the Bellamy farm fell silent for the first time in years. Enoch unlocked the cages. The woman, Rebecca Lowe, staggered forward, barely able to walk. Her eyes were swollen, her wrists torn from days of restraint. She clutched Ford's coat like a drowning soul reaching for driftwood. "He was going to drown us," she whispered. "Said water washes out wickedness." The elderly man, identified later as Reverend Luther Meeks, had no words left. His mind, it seemed, had snapped. He stared forward blankly, whispering scripture in a cracked loop. "He maketh me to lie down. He maketh me to lie down." Harrow, the man who'd been kneeling at the altar, had bruises across his chest in the shape of rope. But he was alive and furious. He ripped the gag from his mouth and spat onto the floor where Malachi had once stood. "They said I was arrogant," he muttered, "that I needed humbling. I build roads, not kingdoms. That was my crime." They led the survivors out through the root cellar into the brittle night air. The stars above Elmridge seemed impossibly bright, as if the heavens had finally looked down on what was buried beneath that soil. But the horror wasn't over. As dawn approached, the raiding party returned to the tunnels to assess the full extent of what the Bellamys had built. They weren't prepared. Behind one concealed panel, they found a room filled with ledgers. Delilah's hand, delicate, careful, had recorded everything: names, ages, trades, the goods they carried, whether they had been compliant, how long they lived. 67 names. Some were listed with initials only, others with comments, cried at the end. Wrote a hymn before judgment, refused to confess. And then came the trophies, a room filled with what could only be described as souvenirs: buttons, shawls, boots, a child's toy carved from pine, pieces of people who had trusted too easily. In the deepest chamber, Enoch made the final discovery: a shaft descending into a natural limestone crevice, ropes bolted to the wall, blood-stained platforms, and at the bottom, what looked like an ossuary. Dozens of bones, skulls, femurs, rib cages broken like twigs. They'd been disposing of bodies here for years. Ford stood at the edge of the pit and whispered the only prayer he could remember. Then he lit the torch. What had once been a house of hospitality was now a tomb. And by morning, it would be ash. By sunrise, smoke billowed from the ruins of the Bellamy homestead, twisting into the pine sky like a warning to God. The main house, the barn, the smokehouse, all reduced to charred skeletons. The underground chambers were sealed with rubble and oil-soaked canvas, then collapsed inward with dynamite brought from a distant mining crew. Ford insisted on it. "No one should walk over that soil and not feel it shake," he said. Word of the raid spread faster than any fire. By week's end, Elmridge became a town caught in its own reflection, ashamed, stunned, frightened. These were the people they had trusted, sat beside in pews, bought medicine from, praised from the pulpit. No one had seen the signs, or worse, they had, and chosen not to speak. Ford didn't attend church the following Sunday, neither did anyone else. Delilah Bellamy was placed in protective custody. Her testimony was too detailed, too consistent to ignore. She identified every victim she could recall, pointed out false burial sites meant to mislead, and provided dates that matched missing person records across 5 counties. She never asked for mercy. "I stayed too long," she told Ford. "I watched. I helped. Even if I hated it, I still watched." Ford didn't reply. He'd already filed for leniency. The others were beyond judgment. Malachi and Abram were dead. Cyrus's body had been found near the escape tunnel, his throat slit by his own knife in a final panicked act of defiance. Sybil was caught a day later in the woods, barefoot, chanting scripture, her arms covered in her own blood. She didn't resist, but she didn't speak either. She simply stared into the faces of her captors with a look of mournful disappointment, as if they were the ones who had betrayed her. The trial, held weeks later in Fort Houston, drew hundreds. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledgers, the victims' belongings, the chambers themselves. The judge sealed parts of the record. "It's not for common eyes," he said. "There's evil in the his world that hides behind scripture. Best it stays buried." Sybil was sentenced to hang. Delilah received life. Ford received no praise, no medals, just quiet nods from strangers who couldn't meet his gaze. The road through Pine Hollow was rerouted within the year. No markers, no gravestones, just trees growing thick and silent where fire once danced. But the wind still shifted wrong near the ash field, and some nights it carried voices. Years passed, but the wounds never closed. By 1812, Elmridge was half abandoned. The Silver Elm Inn boarded its windows. Abner's store stood shuttered, its signs swinging in the wind like a forgotten warning. Families moved west, citing poor soil or harsh winters, but everyone knew the truth. The Bellamy name had rotted the roots of the town. Children were forbidden from saying it aloud. Old maps quietly removed the farm from their pages. Even the chapel was torn down, replaced with an empty patch of dirt no one dared till. But no matter how much time passed, something beneath the soil never truly rested. Constable Israel Ford never served again. He left Elmridge one October morning with a single bag, no farewell, and a face lined by years he hadn't yet lived. He drifted south to the Sabine River, where he took up work as a ferryman, refusing pay from women, children, or anyone traveling alone. They said he spoke little, except when someone asked if the road ahead was safe. Then he'd pause, squint at the trees, and mutter, "Safer than where I've been." Delilah Bellamy served her sentence at the Nacogdoches Women's Penal House, a structure more timber and rust than stone. She refused visitors for the first 2 decades. When a new warden arrived and asked why she never spoke of her father's crimes, she replied, "I've said enough. Let the rest rot with him." She died in 1854, just after her 72nd birthday. Her last request was denied. Burial outside the prison walls, unmarked. Instead, she was laid in the penal ground near the fence. Her grave remains there still, a patch of earth where nothing grows. Of the survivors, only 2 lived long enough to see their names cleared. Harrow, the surveyor, became a vocal advocate for missing persons laws in the territory. He carried the scars around his neck until the day he died, often pointing to them when he spoke in courtrooms. "This is what trust buys," he would say. Never confuse manners for decency. Rebecca Lowe married a preacher but never returned to church. She raised 4 sons and taught them 2 rules. Never eat food you didn't watch get cooked, and never follow a man who quotes the Bible too well. As for the cave system beneath the Bellamy farm, it was never fully excavated. After one worker vanished during the demolition, the crew refused to continue. They sealed it in with stones, prayers, and silence. But everyone knew that silence could break again. All it needed was a scream. By the time the Texas territory joined the Union, the Bellamy story had already become local legend, told in hushed tones around campfires stripped of detail and bloated with superstition. Some said the family had worshipped demons in the woods. Others claimed the land was cursed long before they arrived. But those who had seen the ledgers, those who had walked through the chambers, knew it wasn't witchcraft. It was will, cold, practiced, and dressed in virtue. In 1861, a Union soldier stationed near the ruins of Elmridge found a rusted chain jutting from the earth while digging a trench. His commanding officer ordered him to ignore it. Days later, the soldier disappeared. No body was ever found, only his boots, lined neatly near the edge of a sinkhole. That sinkhole grew over the years, swallowing fence posts and trees. Locals began calling the area the Hollow Mouth. No one built near it. Animals refused to graze there. Even birds flew wide around the trees. In 1889, a railroad crew surveying a new line through the region abruptly changed course. The reason? A series of tremors and deep, unnatural sounds, as one foreman put it. They never officially reported the incident, but one worker wrote in a letter to his wife, "There's something under that land, something that remembers." The letter was found years later, tucked in a Bible at a thrift shop in Austin. Attempts to investigate the ruins were sporadic and always ended abruptly. In 1924, a group of amateur historians funded a dig at the Bellamy site. They arrived with 6 men, modern tools, and a camera. They left 3 days later, shaken and silent. No photos were ever published. One of the diggers, a man named George Tillman, reportedly returned to the site alone in the dead of winter. He was never seen again, but his notebook was recovered. Inside were only 3 sentences. "It's not the place that's evil, it's the echo, and it's still listening." By the mid-20th century, maps once again marked the area, but only as a cautionary zone. Unstable ground, unsafe terrain, private property. All legal excuses to keep people out. Because beneath the roots and soot and memory, something still shifted in the dark. The Bellamys were gone, but their house, the one they carved beneath the earth, remained, waiting. In the present day, few in East Texas remember the Bellamy name. Elmridge exists only in archived maps and folklore, swallowed by pine and time. But if you ask the right people, those who inherit keys to locked church basements or sift through case files with missing pages, you'll find echoes of what really happened. And in rare instances, the land itself seems to remember. In 1976, a contractor clearing forest near the old Pine Hollow route reported finding old foundation stones and what appeared to be ventilation shafts. The crew unearthed a stone slab carved with symbols no one could explain, circles within circles, crossed by slashes. The slab was stolen the following night. In 1991, a Texas State University professor published a brief, anonymous paper titled "Ritual Architecture in Early Settler Communities: The Elmridge Hypothesis." The university pulled the article after 1 week, citing historical inaccuracies. But those who read it remember the diagram of the Bellamy tunnels, accurate down to the sealed ossuary pit, and a chilling final footnote. We have no record of where the Bellamys learned to build like this. Some believe the knowledge wasn't learned, it was given. The few surviving Bellamy artifacts, Delilah's green ledger, the crucifix from the trial hall, fragments of Sybil's herbal texts, are locked in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the Fort Houston Historical Museum. They're not on display. The curator has been quoted saying, "Not all things from the past belong in the light." Even now, hikers occasionally vanish near the old grounds, always dismissed as accidents, bad weather, poor navigation, animal attacks, but the pattern holds. Every few years, always near the hollow mouth, always silence, followed by a search, followed by nothing. The soil is thick with root and rot, but dig deep enough and you'll hit stone. Dig deeper, and you might find the iron rings, thigh, shackles. The steps, there's no plaque, no warning sign, no memorial. Only a whisper passed between those who know. If you hear someone praying in the woods, walk the other way. Because some sermons don't end, some judges never sleep, and some farms don't grow crops. They grow quiet. They grow cold. And if you stand long enough above them, they begin to listen again.